How 3,000 Winged Hussars destroyed 80,000 Ottomans. The charge that saved Europe. The wind off the Kahlenberg Ridge carried the smell of smoke, of death, of 60,000 corpses rotting in the summer heat below Vienna's shattered walls.
Pasha army.
It had been building for 60 days. 60 days of cannon fire and sappers burrowing like blind moles beneath the city's foundations. 60 days of starvation inside the walls.
To understand what was at stake, you have to understand the Ottoman Empire as was in 1683.
The Ottoman camp stretched across the Viennese plain like a second city. A glittering, jeweled serpent coiled around its prey. 200,000 souls in silk and leather and iron. A civilization unto itself that had swallowed nations whole and was now,
their artillery is positioned here. We attack at this point.
That exposes our left flank to their
cavalry. We must take that risk if we want the high ground
by sunrise. On the ridge above,
sunrise.
King Jan III Sobieski of Poland knelt in the pre-dawn darkness and heard mass. He prayed not as a king prays, for victory, for glory, for his name in the chronicles, but as a man prays when he knows the world rests on a
The Allied infantry moved first, pushing into the Wienerwald in
dark,
three great columns,
100,000 soldiers from across Christendom breathed the same cold air and thought the same cold thoughts. Austrians, Saxons, Bavarians, Franconians, and at the tip of the spear the warriors who had ridden further than any of them, who had answered the call when no one else would, the Winged Hussars of Poland. 3,000 men in gleaming armour with great wooden frames arching above their backs, fitted with eagle and ostrich feathers that would catch the wind and fill the air with a thunderous drumming as they
still
charged.
The Hussars waited on the ridge.
Against them, across the valley, waited Kara Mustafa Pasha's army. The numbers defy easy comprehension. 80,000 Ottoman fighting men in the field, and that is the conservative estimate. Some chroniclers counted more. Against them, a relief army of 65,000 Europeans, outnumbered on open ground, exhausted from their march, fighting on behalf of a city that might already be dead. But numbers tell only part of this story. They tell you the scale of desperation, yes. They tell you the arithmetic of the gamble.
The Ottoman camp below them was vast,
is what it meant
its way
for
beautiful.
Vienna, for the Holy Roman Empire,
enemies of
for the Ottoman dynasty at its zenith, for every European capital that lay open and undefended in the path of an advancing army that had never lost a major campaign in living memory. A defeat here did not mean a lost battle. A defeat here meant the fall of the heart of Europe.
Advancing on the center.
It meant an Ottoman road running from Constantinople to Paris, unbroken by any fortress that could stand against that siege train. It meant the end of one civilization's dominance and the beginning of another's. This battle changed everything, not because of the numbers, because of what happened in the final hours of September 12, 1683, when 3,000 men on horseback did something so audacious,
It's almost ready.
so perfectly executed, so historically
The men are
unrepeatable,
hungry, and the fires
that
draw
military
too much
commanders
attention.
would study it in awe for the next 300 years. The largest cavalry charge in recorded history.
Get those
And it
crates
worked.
loaded onto the cart now! We're running out of
This
time!
is how it happened.
Move it, men!
The world before the charge. To understand what was at stake on that September morning, you have to understand the Ottoman Empire not as it appears in history books, a declining power, a future problem, a cautionary tale, but as it was in 1683, the most formidable military and political organism on earth. The Ottoman Empire had been expanding westward for 2.5 centuries without meaningful interruption. It had devoured the Byzantine Empire in 1453, erased the medieval kingdoms of Serbia and Bulgaria, absorbed Hungary, reduced the Mediterranean to a contested lake, and broken every coalition that Christendom had assembled against it. The Sultan's army had besieged Vienna once before in 1529, and though that siege had failed, it had failed only because of logistics. Logistics and weather, not because anyone had stopped them. The lesson Europe took from 1529 was not confidence, it was terror. They had been lucky. They might not be lucky again. By 1683, the empire was ruled by Sultan Mehmed IV, but the real architect of the campaign was his Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man of extraordinary ambition and considerable military skill, whose name translates simply as Black Mustafa, and who had spent years preparing for this moment. Kara Mustafa was not, as European propaganda would later insist, a barbaric conqueror driven by religious fanaticism. He was a cold, calculating imperialist who understood that the control of Vienna meant the control of the Danube, and the control of the Danube meant the ability to project Ottoman power into the heart of Western Europe for the next century. He had lobbied the Sultan for this campaign. He had organized the logistics of moving 200,000 people, soldiers, merchants, servants, camp followers, livestock, across 1,000 miles of terrain. He had done everything right up to the moment the walls of Vienna held long enough for help to arrive. The city itself was defended by Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, a Habsburg officer of iron constitution and legendary stubbornness, who had been left with only 15,000 soldiers when Emperor Leopold I had fled the city before the Ottomans arrived. Leopold's flight was, at the time, considered a catastrophic act of cowardice. He had abandoned his capital, his people, and his duty, and ridden west with his court. But it had had one unintended consequence. It freed him to beg for help, and he begged brilliantly. He rode to every German prince, every Catholic sovereign, every military commander who might be persuaded that Vienna's fall was their problem too. Most of them hesitated. Most of them calculated. Most of them worried about their own borders, their own succession crises, their own treasury. The Habsburgs had enemies in Europe too. France, notably, watched with something close to satisfaction as its great rival struggled. But one man answered without hesitation. Jan III Sobieski, King of Poland, was at this point in history perhaps the most celebrated military commander in Europe, and certainly the most feared by the Ottomans. He had spent his career fighting them. At the Battle of Khotin in 1673, he had crushed an Ottoman army and emerged as a national hero. He understood their tactics, their weaknesses, their psychology. He also understood something that the German princes did not seem to grasp. If Vienna fell, Poland was next. There was no negotiating with an empire that had just taken the key to the continent. He had no illusions about what a Habsburg collapse meant for Warsaw. And so he rode. Sobieski's march to Vienna was an epic of logistics and willpower. He had to move a Polish army of 27,000 soldiers across hundreds of miles, coordinate with German and Austrian forces he had never commanded before, establish a unified command structure over men who spoke different languages and served different masters, and arrive in time. In time. Those two words carried the weight of history. Starhemberg's garrison was running out of men. The Ottomans had detonated mines beneath the walls. Sections of the city's defenses were crumbling. By early September, observers with telescopes watching from the Kahlenberg Ridge could see Ottoman soldiers occupying the outer works of the city. Days. They had days. The political situation complicated everything. The German princes who had gathered to relieve Vienna, the Duke of Lorraine, the electors of Saxony and Bavaria, the commanders of a dozen smaller contingents, were proud men who chafed at taking orders from a foreign king, even one as renowned as Sobieski. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold, who might have unified command, had fled and could not return in time. Someone had to lead. Someone had to be trusted with the fate of the continent. After political negotiation that required all of Sobieski's considerable diplomatic skill, command was given to the Polish king. He was 54 years old, heavy with age and the weight of a lifetime of campaigns, and he had ridden through mountains to be here. He had left his wife, his court, and his kingdom. He had come because he understood what the moment required. and because somewhere in the combination of cold calculation and burning faith that made up Jan Sobieski's character, he believed that this was the day he had been built for. The difficulty of what he had assembled around him deserves acknowledgement that history sometimes forgets to provide. The Allied army at Vienna was not a unified force in any meaningful modern sense. It was a coalition of sovereign powers, each with its own chain of command, its own tactical traditions, its own political interests, and its own understanding of what this campaign was for. The Austrian contingent fought for their city and their emperor. The Bavarians and Saxons fought partly for religious solidarity, and partly because they understood, correctly, that an Ottoman Vienna would eventually mean an Ottoman Bavaria. The Poles fought because Sobieski had told them to, and because they trusted him, and because the eastern frontier had taught them better than any Western European prince what an unchecked Ottoman expansion actually looked like from the ground level. Getting these forces to operate together, to take orders from a single Polish king, without the friction of wounded pride and contradictory instruction destroying their effectiveness before the battle even began, was itself a diplomatic achievement of the first order. Sobieski had accomplished it through a combination of genuine authority, personal reputation, and the unifying pressure of a threat to large to allow the luxury of disagreement. They were civilizational. The Ottoman siege had already cut off Vienna from the rest of the continent. The city's population had fallen from 100,000 to perhaps 80,000, as plague, starvation, and bombardment did their work. Starhemberg himself was ill. The garrison had been reduced to a fraction of its fighting strength. The great Gothic spires of St. Stephen's Cathedral still rose above the walls, visible for miles, visible to the relief army as they climbed the Kahlenberg. A symbol, a beacon, a question. Was it too late? Could 65,000 men, coordinated over a single day, fight through 80,000 hardened veterans and break a siege that had consumed the summer? The generals had their doubts. Sobieski, if he had doubts, did not show them. He had heard Mass on the Kahlenberg. He had looked down at the camp below, that vast, glittering serpent of an army, and made his plan. And somewhere in the pre-dawn dark, 3,000 men in winged armor checked their lances, their sabers, their saddle cinches, and waited for the order that would either save Europe or end the world they knew. The ground, the army, the plan. The terrain below the Kahlenberg Ridge was not ideal for the kind of battle anyone wanted to fight. The eastern slopes descending toward the Ottoman camp were steep in places, choked with vineyards and orchards and small stone walls that had been built over centuries by Viennese farmers who had no idea their property would one day become a battlefield. The Vienna woods, the Wienerwald, ran south along the ridge, dense with oak and beech, the kind of forest that swallows cavalry and breaks formations into confused fragments. Any army descending from the ridge to the plain below would have to thread between the trees, manage broken ground, keep cohesion on slopes where horses slip and formations dissolve, and emerge onto the open plain with enough momentum and order to fight. This was not, in other words, country suited to a cavalry charge. The Ottoman commanders knew this. They had looked at the terrain and made a rational calculation. The ridgeline was an obstacle, not a threat. Even if a relief army arrived and descended from the hills, the broken ground would shatter any attack before it could gain momentum. Their own flanks were protected by geography. They were confident. They were wrong, for reasons that came down to the specific nature of the force Sobieski had brought to the field. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1683 fielded what was arguably the most specialized heavy cavalry force in the world. The Winged Hussars, Husaria in Polish, were not hussars in the way that term is usually understood in Western European military history. They were not light cavalry. They were not raiders or scouts. They were an armored shock cavalry force, the heaviest and most expensive military formation in the Polish army, equipped with gear that had been refined over a century of fighting on the eastern frontier. A hussar trooper wore a closed-face helmet and breast and back plate armor, sometimes with additional shoulder and arm protection. His primary weapon was the kopia, a hollow lance made of fir wood up to 6 meters long, filled with a charge that made it lighter than it looked and nearly impossible for infantry to parry. When a formation of hussars struck an enemy line at full gallop, the physical force of the impact was calculated in tons. They were not soldiers, they were weapons. Behind each saddle rose the famous wooden frame, 2 curved poles arching up and back, fitted with feathers from eagles, ostriches, and herons. The practical function of these wings is still debated by historians. Some argue they were designed to prevent enemy cavalry from using lassos to drag hussars from their horses.
Others maintain they created the sound, that the rushing wind through thousands of feathers produced a roar, a mechanical thunder that terrified enemy horses and broke cavalry formations before contact. Most likely it was both and something more. The wings were a statement, a declaration, the visual signature of a force that had spent a century making its appearance alone worth 1,000 men in fear. When the winged hussars came over a ridge in formation, their plumes catching the morning light, their hoofbeats rising from individual sound to collective thunder, the psychological effect on enemy infantry, men who had never faced them before, who had heard only stories, was documented by enough contemporaries to be taken seriously. Sobieski had 3,000 of them. He had positioned them at the center of his line, the place of honor, the point of the spear. Around them were the remaining cavalry of the Polish force, the lighter German and Austrian horse, and the infantry that would clear the broken ground on the slopes. The plan was sequential and logical. Infantry would push through the Wienerwald during the morning, driving back the Ottoman forward positions, clearing the ridgeline, opening the path to the plain. The cavalry would wait on the high ground, visible, menacing, contained, while the infantry did the slow, grinding work of the morning hours. Then, when the path was clear, when the Ottoman forces were committed against the infantry assault and stretched thin, when the afternoon light was right, the hussars would come down. Sobieski had spent the night of September 11th in his command tent with his senior commanders, working through the details with the patience of a man who had done this before and understood that the difference between brilliant plans and disastrous ones was usually preparation. The Duke of Lorraine commanded the left wing of the Allied line, the Austrian and German troops who would push along the valley floor and maintain pressure on the Ottoman center. The Elector of Saxony held the right flank. Sobieski himself took the center, the position from which he could control the cavalry arm and judge the moment of commitment. But the night before a battle is not only generals and maps. In the dark beyond the command tents, 100,000 soldiers were doing the things soldiers have always done before they face death. Men wrote letters they knew might never be delivered. They sharpened blades they had already sharpened 3 times, the repetitive motion a kind of prayer. They sat with friends and spoke of home, of wives, of children, of fields that needed harvesting, of small domestic details that suddenly seemed enormous when viewed from the edge of extinction. Some prayed openly, on their knees in the dirt, their lips moving with the words their mothers had taught them. Others drank, quietly, not to excess, just enough to take the edge off the knowledge of what morning would bring. The Hussar Knights had their own rituals. They were the elite, the most expensive and most honored military formation in Europe's most warlike kingdom, and they understood what they were being asked to do. The charge they were preparing for, if it came, would be unlike anything in living memory. The scale was unprecedented. 3,000 horsemen riding simultaneously, in formation, across broken ground, into an army of 80,000. Even by the standards of men who had ridden charges before, who had learned their trade on the bloody eastern frontier, this was a different thing. This was history pressing itself against a moment and demanding an answer. The Ottoman camp below them was vast and, in its way, beautiful. Even the enemies of the Sultan described it with something like awe. A sea of colored tents stretching for miles, lit at night by thousands of fires, the whole thing organized with a precision that reflected the empire's administrative genius. The Sultan's tent, not Kara Mustafa's command tent, but the ceremonial tent of the Ottoman dynasty itself, a structure of red and gold that was said to contain enough room for a cavalry squadron to parade inside, stood at the center like a court in miniature. Around it were the tents of the viziers, the pashas, the janissary commanders, the Spahi cavalry lords. It was the government of an empire, the nerve center of the most powerful army on earth, and it was arranged with perfect confidence in its own security. That confidence was its weakness. Kara Mustafa had committed the cardinal sin of siege warfare. He had allowed himself to become so focused on the objective, Vienna, crumbling, almost taken, that he had underestimated the threat at his rear. His defensive positions on the Kahlenberg slopes were real, and they would slow the Allied advance during the morning. But they were not enough. They had never been designed to stop a fully committed relief army of 65,000 men, backed by the best cavalry force in Europe. They were designed to delay. And delay on September 12, 1683, was not sufficient. As dawn broke, the Allied infantry began their descent. The battle, from ridge to plain. Phase 1, the descent, dawn to mid-morning. The guns began before sunrise. The Allied artillery, positioned on the ridge line with a view down the valley toward the Ottoman camp, opened fire in the gray pre-dawn light, the muzzle flashes orange and violent against the fading dark. Below, Ottoman guns answered, and for a while the ridge was wrapped in smoke and noise, a rolling thunder that woke every soldier in both armies and confirmed what everyone already knew. The day had come. The waiting was over. The Allied infantry moved first, pushing into the Wienerwald in 3 great columns, fighting through undergrowth and over stone walls and through the tangled rows of the Viennese vineyards, while Ottoman light troops fell back before them, trading ground for time, contesting every clearing and every ridgeline track. It was grinding, ugly work, not the heroic battle of legend, but the hard, anonymous violence of men pushing through trees with musket and pike, killing and being killed in penny packets over terrain too broken for any general to control. Officers shouted orders that couldn't be heard. Formations dissolved and reformed and dissolved again, but they moved forward. The Ottoman defenders on the slopes were numerous enough to slow the descent, but not enough to stop it, and Kara Mustafa, who had most of his best troops committed to the siege lines against Vienna, could not reinforce quickly enough. By 7 in the morning, the Allied right flank under the Elector of Saxony had cleared the first major ridge spur and begun emerging onto more open ground. By 9, the Duke of Lorraine's left wing was fighting in the orchards and vineyards below the tree line, visible from the walls of Vienna, visible to Starhemberg's garrison, who watched from the battered battlements and felt, for the first time in 60 days, something they had nearly forgotten the name of: hope. Raw and fragile and terrifying, because hope in that situation meant the possibility of disappointment, which was worse than despair. The Ottoman response was powerful, but reactive. Kara Mustafa had not expected the Allied descent to move this quickly. The vine-choked terrain that his commanders had relied upon as natural protection was proving permeable to determined infantry, and his own forward troops were being pushed back faster than planned. He began pulling units from the siege lines to reinforce his defensive positions on the slopes, a rational decision that created a second problem. It weakened the assault on Vienna at the precise moment when the garrison inside was beginning to believe rescue was possible. Starhemberg, watching the Ottoman redeployment, made the call that would define his legacy. He sortied. With the last coherent reserves of his garrison, his weakened and starving and disease-ridden soldiers, he launched a counterattack from the city gates, striking the weakened Ottoman siege lines at the moment of maximum Ottoman distraction. It was a gamble that could have destroyed his last fighting force. Instead, it tied down Ottoman troops that might otherwise have reinforced the slopes. But Phase 1 was the infantry's battle, and it was brutal and inconclusive. Ground was gained. Men died by the dozens, the hundreds, in actions that had no names and would have no monuments.
The Allied line crept downward, hour by hour, clearing the Wienerwald and fighting through the last cultivated ground between the forest and the plain. Phase 2. The plain opens, mid-morning to noon. By noon, something critical had happened. The Allied infantry had largely cleared the wooded ridgeline and was beginning to emerge onto the open ground of the lower slopes, the last natural barrier between the relief army and the Ottoman camp. This was the turning point in the terrain analysis, the moment Sobieski had been waiting for. The slope from here to the plain was gentler, the obstacles were fewer. The ground that would swallow cavalry had given way to ground where cavalry could operate. But the Ottomans were not giving up the plain without a fight. Kara Mustafa threw his Spahi cavalry, the heavy horsemen of the Ottoman Empire, fearsome soldiers who had had broken European armies before, into the gap between the Allied infantry and the open ground. The Spahi were numerous,
perhaps 15,000 strong in the initial commitment, and they struck the Allied infantry hard, driving back the German units on the right flank and threatening to roll up the Allied line before it could stabilize on the lower slopes. The next 2 hours were the most dangerous period of the battle for the Allied cause. The German infantry, not as experienced as the Poles and fighting on unfamiliar ground, took casualties and gave ground. The Duke of Lorraine's left wing held better, pressing forward through the valley floor, but the center was bending. The Ottoman cavalry reserve, uncommitted until now, began moving to reinforce the Spahi assault. If they broke through the center, the Allied line would split, and the momentum of the morning would be lost. Sobieski watched from the ridge. He watched the Spahi charge. He watched the German line bend. He watched the Ottoman reserve cavalry begin their movement. And he made his calculation. Not yet. He held the Hussars. Phase 3. The weight of waiting. Noon to mid-afternoon. This is the part of the battle that military historians return to again and again, not for the drama of what happened, but for the difficulty of what didn't happen. Sobieski had 3,000 of the finest cavalry in the world, watching their allies take casualties on the plain below. The instinct of any cavalry commander, the training, the culture, the centuries of tradition embedded in the very concept of the mounted warrior, was to charge, to ride to the aid of the infantry, to use the Hussars to smash the Spahi assault before it could complete its work. Sobieski waited. He waited because he understood something that emotion resisted and calculation demanded. The moment was not right. The ground was still not fully clear. The Ottoman Spahi, though powerful, had not yet spent themselves against the Allied line. A premature charge would meet fresh, organized cavalry with room to maneuver, and even Hussars, even those Hussars, could be stopped by a well-handled cavalry force with space to operate. Sobieski needed the Ottomans committed. He needed them extended. He needed them looking inward, at the infantry assault, at the crumbling siege lines, at the sortie from Vienna, at the dozen crises competing for Kara Mustafa's attention. He needed the moment when no one on the Ottoman side was looking up at the ridge. The hours passed in the paradox of waiting, time both frozen and racing. The sounds of battle drifted up from the plain, the crack of muskets, the deeper boom of field artillery, the collective human noise of thousands of men in violent contact, a sound that has no peacetime equivalent and leaves everyone who has heard it marked. The Hussar horses shifted and stamped. The feathers on the wings caught the afternoon wind and chattered softly, a sound like distant rain. The knights in their armor felt the heat of the September sun and waited for the word. Below, the battle was developing exactly as Sobieski had calculated. The Spahi assault had driven back the German infantry, but had not broken it. The Austrians and Bavarians had steadied, reformed, and the Duke of Lorraine's steady pressure on the left was forcing the Ottomans to commit more and more troops to maintain the line. Kara Mustafa, facing crises in multiple directions, was losing the coherent control of his forces. Units were moving in response to immediate threats rather than coordinated plan. The great Ottoman army, which had been so perfectly organized the day before, was beginning to fragment into 100 separate actions, each demanding attention, none receiving enough. The sortie from Vienna was bleeding the siege lines white. Starhemberg's men who had been starving for 60 days, men who should by any physical measure have been incapable of sustained combat, were fighting with the frantic energy of those who understand they are fighting for their lives and for the end of their suffering. Every Ottoman soldier pulled from the siege to deal with the sortie was one fewer soldier watching the ridge. Sobieski watched. He calculated. He waited. The waiting itself was a form of command. Every subordinate commander who looked up at the ridge and saw the Polish king unmoving, his cavalry still, his standard planted on the high ground, received a message that could not have been delivered in words. This is not the moment. Trust the plan. Trust the man who made it. The German officers who had chafed at taking orders from a foreign king were watching that stillness and learning something about the difference between commanders who react and commanders who think. There is a kind of courage that shows itself in the charge. There is another kind that shows itself in the waiting, and it is rarer, and it is harder. And it was Jan Sobieski's defining quality on September 12th, 1683. The afternoon sun moved across the sky with indifferent patience. The fighting on the plain below continued its grinding progress. Ottoman batteries that had been positioned to pound the walls of Vienna were now being repositioned, trying to address the threat from the slopes, which meant they were no longer pounding the walls of Vienna, which meant Starhemberg's garrison had a brief window of relative safety from bombardment, a window through which they were still pouring their counterattacking fury against the siege lines. The Ottoman command structure, which had been a marvel of coordination through 60 days of siege operations, was now visibly straining. Messengers arrived at Kara Mustafa's headquarters at intervals that grew shorter and shorter, each carrying news of a fresh crisis. The left flank needed reinforcement. The siege lines were buckling. The Spahi cavalry were engaged and could not disengage without creating a gap in the main line. The reserves that Kara Mustafa had believed would be sufficient to handle a relief army were being consumed at a rate that his morning calculations had not anticipated. Because his morning calculations had not included the possibility that the Allied infantry would move this fast through the Wienerwald. They had not included Starhemberg's counterattack. They had not included the perfect coordination of an Allied force that, despite its political differences and its multiple commanders, was fighting as a single organism under the direction of a single intelligence. Kara Mustafa was an experienced commander. He was not a stupid man. But he was fighting an enemy whose quality he had underestimated, on a day when underestimation had become fatal. And still the Hussars waited on the ridge. Phase 4. The charge. Mid-afternoon, approximately 5 p.m. There is a silence that falls immediately before catastrophic violence. Veterans speak of it. It is not the absence of sound. There was plenty of sound on the plain below, but a quality of suspension, a held breath in the universe, as if the world itself pauses to register what is about to happen. The order came. 3,000 Winged Hussars, formed in a line nearly 2 kilometers wide, began to move. They did not move all at once. The charge built from a walk, then a trot, the ground beginning to shake beneath the coordinated hoofbeats of 6,000 horses, then a canter, formations maintaining their dressing with the discipline of men who had practiced this for years, who understood that the geometry of the charge was as much a weapon as the lance, then full gallop, and then the wings caught the wind. The sound is documented in multiple contemporaneous accounts and described in similar terms by witnesses who had no reason to coordinate their testimony. It was like a storm. It was like nothing they had heard. The feathers of 3,000 sets of wings, accelerating through the afternoon air, created a rushing, drumming roar that built and built as the formation gained speed, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the earth and the air and the sky, a sound that the Ottoman soldiers on the receiving end had never heard and could not interpret. The ground shook, the air shook, the horizon dissolved into a line of flashing steel and plunging feathers, and the terrible, deepening thunder of the charge. The Ottoman cavalry saw them coming. The ones who survived would describe it in terms that shared a common thread, regardless of their individual vantage points. Not as soldiers descending, but as weather arriving, as something elemental. The line of feathers on the ridge that had been still all day was moving now, a pale, shimmering horizon that resolved into individual shapes as it came closer, individual shapes that became men and horses, and the sound that accompanied them was wrong. Not the sound of cavalry, not the rhythmic percussion of hoofbeats that the ear expects, but the deeper, stranger, encompassing roar of wind through 10,000 feathers at speed, a sound like nothing else in the military vocabulary of 1683. The Janissary officers tried to give orders. The orders were swallowed by the noise. The horses in the Ottoman lines heard it first, as they always do, and began to shift and rear, and the riders who were trying to manage frightened horses could not simultaneously prepare for the impact that was still coming, still closer, the thunder rising from sound to sensation, felt in the chest and the bones, the earth itself conducting the energy of 6,000 hooves in coordinated descent.
Against them,
They
a relief
broke
army of
first.
65,000 Europeans.
This is the fact that every subsequent analysis
To
circles
understand what
back
was at
to,
stake, you have to understand the
the
Ottoman
fact
Empire
that
as was in
contains within
1683.
it the key to
Cavalry to the
understanding
front.
what happened.
Infantry, follow the banners.
The
Advance.
Ottoman cavalry, brave soldiers, veteran soldiers, soldiers who had broken every European
Their
cavalry
artillery
force
is
they
positioned
had
here. We
faced
attack
for
at
a
this point. That exposes
generation
our left flank to their cavalry.
did
We must
not
take that risk if we
hold.
want the high ground by sunrise.
They had been fighting for hours. They were tired. They were looking the wrong way. And when they turned and saw 3,000
The Allied
hussars
infantry
in
moved
full
first,
gallop
pushing into the
coming
Wiener
down
Wall
the
in three
slope,
great columns, fighting
the
through
thunder
undergrowth.
building to a roar that bypassed thought and struck the animal brain directly. Something broke in them that no drill had prepared for, and no general had trained them to withstand. Some tried to hold. They were consumed. The physics of the Hussar charge at full speed against
Still, the
stationary
Hussars
cavalry
waited on the
is
ridge.
not a contest. It is a conversion.
The wings,
Raw
mark the
kinetic
wings.
energy translated into violence. The hollow lance punching through armor and shields and bodies with a force that nothing could absorb. And behind the lance, the sword. And behind the sword, the momentum of horse and rider carried the attack through 3, 4,
The Ottoman camp
5
below them
men
was vast
before
and
it could
its
be
way
stopped.
beautiful. Even enemies of
The Janissaries of the Ottoman center, the elite infantry, the professional corps of the army, men who did not break easily, formed squares and presented
Sobieski's forces are
pikes
advancing on the center.
and fired their
We must reinforce
muskets,
the left flank.
and they killed hussars, and the hussars did not stop. The line hit the Ottoman camp like a tidal wave breaking over a sandcastle. Phase 5. The collapse and pursuit.
Taste this. It's almost ready.
Evening
We
of
ride out at dawn.
September
Good.
12th.
The men are hungry, and the fires draw too
What
much
followed the initial breakthrough defies the word battle. The word implies two sides
crates loaded onto the
engaged
cart
in
now. We're running out of
organized
time.
mutual
Understood. Move it,
violence.
men.
What happened in the Ottoman camp after the Hussar charge broke the cavalry screen was dissolution. The disintegration of an army that had ceased to be an army and had become a mass of terrified individuals running toward the only direction that offered hope, which was away from the direction of the Hussars. The collapse was astonishing in its speed. Kara Mustafa's headquarters were overrun within the first 30 minutes of the charge. The Grand Vizier himself barely escaped, abandoning the field with a small cavalry escort in a flight that would take him to Belgrade, where he would have several weeks to consider his failures before the Sultan's executioners arrived with a bowstring and ended his career permanently. His headquarters tent and the contents of the Ottoman camp fell to the victors in a state of almost surreal completeness. The Ottomans had not planned for this. They had not conceived of this. No army at the peak of its power, 60 days into a siege it was winning, surrounded by sufficient force to feel secure, had made arrangements for the need to evacuate rapidly. The camp was left exactly as it was, food cooking over fires, personal possessions in their places, the treasury barely touched, the supply wagons full, the livestock still penned. Sobieski's soldiers moved through it like men walking through an interrupted dream. The Allied infantry, which had spent the day grinding down the slopes, now flooded onto the plain behind the cavalry and drove the rout deeper and further. The Ottoman retreat became a rout. The rout became a catastrophe. Units that had maintained order in the initial collapse lost that order in the press of thousands of men trying to move east, away from Vienna, away from the relief army, away from the horror of what had happened in an afternoon. Men drowned in the Danube. Men were cut down in the orchards and vineyards where the morning's infantry fighting had taken place, cut down now by pursuers rather than defenders. The siege lines that had taken months to construct were abandoned, the artillery left behind, the stores and ammunition and all the material of one of the greatest military operations of the century left for the victors to count and catalogue. But the pursuit could only go so far. The relief army was exhausted after a full day of combat and a march of days before that. Night was falling. Sobieski, brilliant enough to know when to stop, called the pursuit before it could dissolve into chaos in the dark. The Hussars came back to the camp they had taken. The Allied infantry secured the siege lines, and for the first time in 60 days, the gates of Vienna could open. The fighting was over. The day that had begun with dawn artillery on the Kahlenberg Ridge ended with the largest cavalry charge in recorded history, having broken the siege of Vienna in a single afternoon. The accounting of a rescued world. The dead were counted in the days that followed, and the numbers told a story of what the day had actually cost. The Allied relief army had lost approximately 3,500 men killed and wounded, a significant number, but remarkably light given the scale of the engagement and the fighting quality of the Ottoman forces. The Hussars themselves, the point of the spear, had suffered perhaps 500 casualties, killed and wounded combined. These were men who rode into the largest cavalry action in history and broke out the other side. Their losses were the measure of their effectiveness. When a force strikes the right target at the right moment with the right preparation, the cost is surprisingly low. The Ottoman losses were catastrophic and still debated. Contemporaneous estimates range widely, as they always do in the chaos of aftermath, but the consensus among modern historians is something approaching 15,000 dead from all causes. Killed in the descent fighting, killed in the charge itself, drowned in the Danube flight, cut down in the pursuit. Many more were wounded. The psychological damage to the army, to the empire's prestige, to the Ottoman self-concept as an invincible force could not be counted in the same way, but it would prove in retrospect to be the most significant casualty of all. Kara Mustafa fled with the remnants of a shattered staff, reaching Belgrade in a state of shock that sources describe not as the composed grief of a military professional, but as something closer to bewilderment. He had been winning. 60 days of systematic progress, the city's defenses failing, the garrison at breaking point, and then an afternoon had undone it all. He wrote to the Sultan. The Sultan's reply came in December, a bowstring delivered by imperial messenger, the Ottoman method of execution for high officials who had failed to publicly be allowed to live. Kara Mustafa received it with apparent composure. He organized his prayers, distributed his personal possessions, and allowed the executioners to do their work. He was buried in Belgrade. The Ottoman army, having lost its commander and its confidence, continued its disorganized retreat east. The battlefield itself was a spectacle of a kind that had not been seen in Europe for generations. The Ottoman camp, the jeweled serpent now stilled and cold, stretched for miles across the Viennese plain, and it was full. Military observers who moved through it in the days after the battle described what they found in terms that read like inventory and legend simultaneously. Hundreds of cannon, thousands of muskets, entire artillery parks with ammunition still sorted and stacked, treasury wagons with gold and silver coin, silk tents of extraordinary size and workmanship, the personal possessions of viziers and pashas, thousands of horses and camels, food stores sufficient to have sustained the siege for months more, and, catalogued carefully by more than one contemporary, 500 pounds of a strange, dark substance that the Ottomans had been importing from the east and consuming in small quantities. The Viennese, encountering this substance for the first time, were uncertain what to do with it. A Pole in the Allied army named Jerzy Franciszek Kulczycki, who spoke Turkish and had served as a spy in Ottoman territory, recognized it. He claimed the entire supply as his reward. He opened a house in Vienna where this substance, coffee, could be prepared and served to the public. It is generally credited as the first coffee house in Western Europe. Of Starhemberg, the man who had held Vienna for 60 days against odds that should have destroyed it, he emerged from the city gates pale, emaciated, burning with fever, to meet Sobieski on the day after the battle. Contemporary accounts describe the meeting as brief and emotional. Starhemberg, who had been ill for weeks and had continued to direct the defense from a stretcher when he could not walk, was carried to the meeting. He and Sobieski embraced. Few words are recorded. The words were not necessary. Sobieski himself walked the battlefield afterward. He had won the greatest military engagement of his career, the battle that would define his legacy and his country's legacy for centuries. He was 54 years old and had ridden through mountains and commanded 100,000 men in a single day's combat, and he was tired in the way that only the end of something enormous can tire a person. He wrote to his wife that evening. He wrote to her often, letters of extraordinary tenderness, and told her that Vienna was saved. He did not describe the dead or the camp or the scale of the victory. He described the smell of the evening air, clean now that the smoke was lifting, and a kind of quiet that had settled over the plain. The quiet would not last long. There were still Ottoman forces in the field. There would be campaigns to follow, cities to retake, a long military process of rolling back the Ottoman positions in Hungary that would take another 16 years. But the direction of that process had been decided on September 12, 1683. The tide had turned, and it would not turn back. What one afternoon changed. The immediate strategic consequences of the Battle of Vienna cascaded through the following years with the certainty of physics. The Ottoman army, having abandoned its siege equipment and lost a substantial portion of its fighting strength, retreated east in disorder. Kara Mustafa's execution removed the most capable Ottoman strategic mind of the generation. The Sultan, Mehmed IV, humiliated by the failure, fell into a political crisis that would lead to his own deposition in 1687. The Holy League, the alliance of Austria, Poland, Venice, and later Russia, that had been forged in the emergency of the siege, now prosecuted an aggressive military campaign that, over the following 16 years, systematically dismantled Ottoman control of Hungary. At the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, the Ottomans surrendered Hungary, Transylvania, Podolia, and Morea, the largest territorial concession in Ottoman history to that point. The empire that had expanded without interruption for 2.5 centuries turned, at Karlowitz, and began a long, uneven, contested retreat that would not end for 200 years. The implications for warfare were immediate and lasting. The Battle of Vienna demonstrated, in the most dramatic possible terms, the continuing viability of heavy cavalry in the era of gunpowder. Military theorists who had been arguing for decades that the musket and the pike had rendered the shock cavalry charge obsolete were confronted with a 3,000-man refutation of their thesis. The Hussars had charged into musket fire and survived it, had broken infantry formations that should have held, had triggered the collapse of an army 4 times their size. The lesson armies took from this, that timing, terrain, and psychological preparation could make cavalry decisive even against firearms, would influence European military thinking for another century, until the Napoleonic era finally settled the question in favor of the gunpowder arm. For Poland, the battle was the apex of a trajectory. Sobieski. Sobieski returned home as the savior of Christendom, celebrated in Rome by the Pope, honored by every Catholic monarch in Europe. He had given Poland its greatest moment of international prestige, the moment when a nation that was already beginning to feel the pressure of its powerful neighbors, Prussia to the west, Russia to the east, stood at the center of European history and bent that history to its will. But the celebration contained a bitter irony. Poland had spent its treasury and its best military resources on a campaign whose primary beneficiary was the Habsburg Empire. The Habsburgs, grateful in the short term, would not forget that a strong Poland was a rival as well as an ally, and the diplomatic consequences of Vienna would play out over the following century in ways that ultimately contributed to Poland's partitioning and disappearance from the map of Europe. Sobieski saved Vienna and arguably hastened Poland's end. He knew this. He had made his choice. The long echo of Vienna in European culture and memory is harder to quantify, but impossible to ignore. The battle was immediately understood, by the people who lived through it, not just by later historians, as a turning point of civilizational significance. Contemporaries wrote of it in exactly those terms: a defense of Christian Europe, a repulsion of the Ottoman threat, a moment when the West had looked into an abyss and, at the last possible instant, stepped back. The language is easy to dismiss as propaganda, as the self-serving narrative of a Christian empire celebrating its survival. But underneath the religious framing lay a demographic and political reality. Vienna had been the key, and the key had held. The cities that lay beyond Vienna, Linz, Regensburg, the German heartland, the trading cities of the Rhine, never had to face the siege that would have come for them if Sobieski had failed. That negative fact, the war that did not happen, the cities that were never burned, the populations that were never displaced, is the most important legacy of all, and the hardest to see, because history cannot easily record what it was saved from. There was a particular quality to the moments in history when events could have gone either way, when the margin between one world and another was measured not in armies or empires, but in the decision of a single commander at a single hour. Sobieski could have charged too early and found the Ottoman cavalry fresh and organized and capable of absorbing the impact. He could have been more cautious still and held the Hussars until the infantry assault had fully resolved, by which point the Ottoman reserves might have stabilized the line. He made, instead, the choice that required the most precise judgment, the choice to act at exactly the right moment, neither before nor after, the moment when the Ottoman forces were maximally extended and minimally prepared, the moment when 3,000 feathered horsemen would hit with maximum force at minimum resistance. That moment lasted perhaps 90 seconds. It lasted long enough. The Winged Hussars themselves would not long outlast their greatest moment. The military reforms of the 18th century, the shift toward line infantry armed with flintlock muskets, the reorganization of European armies along Prussian models, all of these developments gradually rendered the armored shock cavalry obsolete. The Hussaria was disbanded in 1776. Their wings and armor went into museums and private collections. The tradition passed from the realm of the living to the realm of legend. But the legend proved surprisingly durable. 3,000 men in feathered armor became the symbol of something that resisted easy categorization. Not simply military courage, not simply tactical brilliance, but the specific combination of preparation, patience, and decisive action at the precisely right moment that transforms the probable into the impossible. Armies that wait too long lose their opportunity. Armies that charge too early lose their momentum. Sobieski held his cavalry for 8 hours on the ridge above Vienna, watching, calculating, resisting the impulse to act before the moment was ready. And when the moment came, he sent 3,000 feathered horses down a hillside and broke an empire. Centuries later, the Kahlenberg Ridge is a quiet park above Vienna. Tourists come for the view, the same view that Sobieski had on the morning of September 12, 1683. The city spread below in the September light, the Danube glinting east toward the plain where the Ottoman camp once stood. The vineyard terraces are still there, replanted a dozen times in the intervening centuries. St. Stephen's Cathedral still rises above the old city, its Gothic spire visible for miles, the same spire that the relief army watched as they descended the ridge 340 years ago. The ground has no memory, but we do. On that ground, in a single afternoon, 3,000 men and one patient king decided what Europe would become. The wings caught the wind, and the world turned.